So why is glucose management so important?
Well, in a single statement, glucose control and insulin sensitivity are at the heart of high performance and longevity. So, find me a true high performer who's got insulin resistance. Find me a person who's going to live a long time who's got poor glucose management. They don't exist. What I will tell you, speaking to and taking care of a lot of exactly those types of people, is that you'll find high performers often are beginning to have glucose dysregulation, and it's why they're putting on extra pounds. It's why they can't perform the way they did. It's why they're not sleeping as well as they used to. It's why they have the brain fog or the fatigue or the, you know, whatever the symptom is that they're now experiencing or struggling with. We see that all the time. What I think they often don't understand is that they have to keep that dialed in order to continue to perform at a high level. And it's not dissimilar to, maintenance on a car. No one shows up at the mechanic after driving their car for 30,000 miles with no maintenance and says, I don't understand why it smells funny and is making a weird noise. They know why. They didn't do any maintenance. And so one of the key things we check on every patient is we look at a fasting glucose. Three things actually. We look at a fasting glucose, we look at an A1C, hemoglobin A1C, and we look at a fasting insulin level. Because and that's, we do other labs that are related, DHEA, cortisol, sex steroid hormones, thyroid hormone. We look at all this because we know that if we see problems in glucose regulation, then we are catching them early and we're able to intervene. Because what truly happens, I can't tell you how many times I saw people no one who winds up in the cardiac ICU is not surprised to be there. They're all shocked. I can't believe this is my first heart attack. I just ran a 5K. I thought I was healthy, but I eat well. And that's the reality, is people don't have this insight into what their glucose control actually is because their doctors are not doing the right testing. They're not spending the right time counseling them. They're not really taking a solid history. And so finding out what the glucose control really is, looking at the numbers and making decisions based on those things is really the key to maintaining high performance, achieving high performance, and doing it for a long period of time, which is, of course, what, practically speaking, everybody really wants. So
Yeah.
love the
Maybe you can
topic.
just sort of define, glucose dysregulation, insulin resistance, pre-diabetes, and then diabetes, because I know there's a bit of a spectrum. And I know from the research and literature, you can have insulin resistance for 13 years. You go to a normal medical doctor, he checks your fasting glucose, he checks your HbA1c, all good, you think you're fine. And then 10 years later, you get type 2 diabetes, and you're like, oh my goodness, I've been checking my glucose for so long. My 3-month glucose has been good, but you've been suffering with insulin resistance. So maybe define those categories as best as you can. Someone's listening out there and saying, oh, no problem. My glucose is good. My HbA1c is good. My fasting insulin might be even good. And that's why we've also been using CGM. I'm off to Seychelles with the YPO group. They're bringing me out there. And I'm putting a CGM on all the forum members, which is really interesting for them to have a look at the whole workshop and retreat to see what's happening with their glucose. So give us some definitions. And then I want to put it through the frame of heavy metals and toxicity, as well as balancing minerals, being a real cause why people do not have glucose control.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So, yeah, first of all, there is a tremendous amount of discordance between all these different labs. So, let me explain what I mean by that. You'll get people who have white coat hyperglycemia. What that means is that they get really anxious around a blood draw and they happen to have a blood glucose that's fasting that's 120. And maybe they don't actually have a glucose problem. They're just anxious because they're having their blood drawn. Other people will have that value of 120 and they genuinely do have some glucose intolerance or hyperglycemia. You'll have other people who've got an A1C that shows that it's borderline high or high, even though they've got a normal glucose or they've got a low fasting insulin. I mean, at the end of the day, I always tell my patients and my staff, we're either treating a number or we're treating a sign or a symptom. And this gets into really what our goals are in the practice, because the thing is, let's say that we find an abnormality in their fasting insulin, their fasting glucose, their fasting A1C. I find that we actually have to be asking questions about what's their goal before we can really know what to do with those numbers. And let me give people a very concrete example. Now, we recently had an A1C came back in the practice in a pregnant woman that was 4.7, which is incredibly low. And this is a woman who is describing ups and downs in glucose control. She was feeling faint, brain fogged, fatigued. And she needed the message of you need to eat more and more times a day because you are growing another human. You need a lot of fuel to go into the gas tank. And you're clearly running at a low glucose all the time because your A1C is only 4.7. That's incredibly low. Now, at the same time, if you have somebody who's trying to put on muscle mass and their hemoglobin A1C is a 4.7, that person's not going to be able to put on muscle mass because they don't have enough insulin around in order to trigger muscle mass growth. We had a young lady who came in who had an IGF-1 level that was very, very low. And IGF-1, when I see a low IGF-1, I think not eating enough protein or calories in general, but particularly protein, not getting good sleep, or having way too much stress. She's retired, not very much stress. She sleeps very well. What does she not do? She does not eat enough protein. So it's really process of elimination to figure all of that out. But she is someone who needs to eat more protein, maybe even more carbohydrates, if she's going to have the energy that she needs. But she doesn't also have a A1C problem or a glucose problem. And so what she really needs to do is just increase that protein in order to have more energy. So having these conversations with patients about goals before you just dive into recommendations about their labs, I find to be very important. What you'll find, as I was saying, is that you'll have these people who've got, say, normal glucoses, but then they've got a high A1C, or they've got a normal A1C and a normal glucose, but then they've got a high fasting insulin. And really it comes down to, well, what are we going to do for this person in order to try and normalize this number? Because if you're not treating symptoms or signs, you're treating numbers. That's how I don't know how else you can treat a patient. If you're treating the numbers, usually what I'm looking for is, what does this number mean about their long-term health? A high fasting insulin is not compatible in my book with longevity. A high hemoglobin A1C is going to set you up for a shorter lifespan. But at the same time, we have to be asking questions like, well, why is it actually high? We've got a number of patients who we've seen in the practice who have a high A1C who are on a very carb-restricted diet, which obviously plays into the topic you mentioned earlier, which is heavy metals, toxicity, total toxic burden, stress, things like that. But it's important for people to know at the end of the day that you can have these very discordant results. You can have, and that's why I check all of them. Many people would say, well, we just need to check a fasting glucose. We just need to use a CGM. We just need to use an A1C. I just found, having tested enough people, that it might only be 1 in 100, or it might be 1 in 20, or it might be 1 in 10, but there's enough people out there who've got a problem in those labs that are not being checked, that you lose something in the quality of their care when you don't check those things. And it's all about dialing them in so that they have optimal longevity, so long as that's their goal. And that's where we have to talk about, as I was saying before, where are you and what are your goals? We might actually not carb restrict, and we might not actually worry too much about a high normal A1C in someone who, say, wants to gain muscle mass, because we may actually hurt their gains if we carb restrict in order to try and drive that A1C down.